Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the NKR YouTube channel. So, we are now on our fourth interview for our Spring 2024 issue. We have here with us Bianca Trifoi, author of Children at the Center of Society, Prospects for the Study of Childhood in North Korea. So, in this article, she condensed that examining children and childhood is crucial for understanding North Korea and that it kind of further contributes to a deeper engagement with the country's history, culture, and society. So before we go ahead, Bianca, would you please mind introducing yourself to our viewers?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Bianca Trifoi, and I'm a PhD candidate at here at the GW, George Washington University, and I study North Korean and Cold War history with a minor in modern Chinese history. And my dissertation, kind of in the vein of my paper for NKR, analyzes the role of children and childhood in the post-war reconstruction of North Korea in the 1950s and 60s and kind of looking at how creating a concept of a distinctive North Korean child was crucial to state legitimacy and kind of constructing a stable society. And I speak Romanian, English, Spanish, and Korean, and I utilize archives in the US and South Korea and Romania and Hungary for my research. And yeah, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. So thank you for the opportunity through NKR to publish and to do this interview.
So you're a polyglot, is that right?
Well, working on it, working on
Wow,
it.
that's amazing. So it's cool having you here with us. So I'll move on with
Alright.
the first question. So why do you think it's important to understand North Korea's portrayal and treatment of children separate from existing scholarship that we already have on North Korean ideology?
Right. So I think like in my opinion as a historian of North Korea, like I feel like much of the scholarship that's out there on North Korea, whether it's like academic scholarship or more popular journalistic scholarship, it doesn't really delve into the deep analysis of North Korean society or history or values or something like that, right? We generally only see these very like surface level looks into the political elite or the sort of texts produced by the state, which are often in English meant for foreign consumption. So, in my opinion, we can't really glean any like profound understanding of North Korean state society relations. Like, for example, if we're only looking at texts from the Pyongyang Foreign Languages Publishing House, right? Because that's meant for foreign consumption, but a lot of people will only work with those kinds of texts. So I agree with scholars like Andre Schmidt and others who've noted that, like, if we only focus on these things, like, if we only focus on Kim Il sung or Kim Jong un or, right, the kind of North Koreans are brainwashed idea, we actually tend to further prop up and legitimize the regime that we claim to be critiquing or lambasting. So I think we need to sort of right change our focus as scholars of North Korea. So for example, if we look at the field of modern Chinese history, there's been really, really, really great, like fantastic work there that succeeds in taking like seriously the ideas of the Chinese state, whether these were Maoist ideas or later on, right? It takes these ideas seriously and it provides really rich insight into how Chinese people themselves kind of viewed their relationship with the state and how they navigated, the ideas in their society. So I think in North Korean studies, there have been several great works recently that are doing that same thing for North Korea. But right, it's still very lacking. So I hope for my case in my dissertation to demonstrate that if we want to understand the ways North Korean children are treated today, right, which we see in the news a lot, there's a lot of North Korean children are treated terribly, they're robbed of a childhood or something along those lines. I think we need to understand the history of children and childhood in North Korea and like how that's been conceptualized in North Korea because it's different from South Korea, it's different from the US, it's different from other places. So I think this involves leaving behind our like assumptions of what it means to be a child and seeing kind of understanding it from the North Korean perspective of why, what does it mean to be a North Korean child? How do
Mhm.
North Koreans view that in the past? How do they view it today? So in my paper for the North Korean review, I wanted to critique how, like, save for a few select scholars and a few works, most people, most authors in general have kind of not been doing this. They've not been, suspending their own assumptions and beliefs and instead imposing their own ideas into what it means to be a child or a North Korean person more generally. And I think, right, the reason for this is that these negative assumptions surrounding North Korea, they still dictate how people view North Korea, even in the field of North Korean studies. So I was just trying to critique that in my paper.
Yeah, and like you brought up, a lot of time North Korean scholarship works on the scholar's own biases kind of show through in the paper, or there's always the issue of a lack of resources. So, um, what were you exactly looking for when you were picking your main sources for this paper?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, there's always going to be some bias based
Hmm.
on who we are and our own backgrounds, but right, I think it's important to be very holistic in our sources and our analysis. So in my case, for my paper, I wanted to write a paper that evaluates like the scholarship on children and childhood in North Korea and sort of illustrate how this particular scholarship like follows these trends that I mentioned, where, right, that there's these kind of these dominant stereotypes about North Korea that tend to be, you know, largely negative, and I tried to critique these trends because they perpetuate, even in studies of like children in North Korea, they still perpetuate these dominant negative stereotypes instead of examining like North Korean history or society or values, etc., like more deeply and more seriously. So I try to demonstrate in my paper how, right, studying children and childhood, not only in Korea, but like in general in any society, can really lend valuable insight into like the state society relations in any country. And they can and especially in North Korea, it can help enrich our overall understanding of North Korea. So in my paper, I chose to analyze like contemporary material meant for North Korean children. So like, children's literature, stories for children, to show how like societal conceptions of children and childhood in North Korea are reflected in this children's literature, and that through these conceptions we can kind of see how like North Korea thinks of children, and right, and how that's important to understanding kind of what kind of plans does the state make for the child, things like that. So I think that's important not only in the North Korean case, but in any other state, right? In any kind of state society relationship. So I hope I was able to communicate like that kind of idea or argument in my paper for NKR.
Yeah, and so in your analysis of these sources, you sort of bring up the reappearance of the symbolism of nature throughout these children magazines and the idea of the tongshim. So just for our viewers, could you just elaborate on what the tongshim is and how it is related to the party?
Sure. So in regards to Dongshim, right, this kind of comes from Daphna Zur, right? Daphna Zur is like, she's written extensively on the conceptualization of children and childhood in specifically in colonial Korea. And through her like amazing analysis of like children's literature and other works that are written for and about children, excuse me, in colonial Korea. So Daphna Zur, in her work, she identifies Tongshim as this like important element that is encapsulating like what it meant to be a child in Korea, at least how the adults or the caretakers or the people in charge started to think about what it meant to be a child. So in her explanation, right, Tongshim is like, literally you have Tong, which is like Adong, child, and like Shim, which is heart. So literally it's like child heart. And according to her, it means like a sense of childlike innocence, right? Like having a child heart means you're kind of pure, innocent, and right, she argues that this kind of innocence, this purity, was something that the adults or the caretakers or the state, whoever, they wanted to protect it, but also kind of mold it in the image that they want. So she argues that like children were seen kind of like not quite in culture, but on the threshold of culture. So they weren't quite cultured yet, they were still closer to nature, so that they're like inherently close to nature. So they need to be sort of molded and guided as they become part of culture, which I think is a really interesting, description of how she pins that down. And she also argues that, right, that this idea of Tongshin was actually like flipped on its head after the colonial era ended. So right? And after the division of the peninsula, the changing kind of pressures and priorities of the Cold War resulted in children kind of being imagined now as agents in control of nature rather than as being like one with nature, according to her, right? So she looks at like North Korean science fiction in particular to show that like instead of being of nature, now these children are like controlling nature, which I think is really interesting. And right, for my research, like I think this is something that needs to be that I need to, or right, in general, it needs to be looked into a bit more closely, especially my future research. But what I did see in my like cursory dive into contemporary North Korean children's literature is that I found that the association with nature and innocence and purity, right, that all of this needs protection. I thought I found that it was still very much there, right? So while Zer says it kind of gets abandoned, I found that it was still there. And I don't want to like say she's wrong or go against her in any way, right? But I just found that in contemporary North Korean literature, there is this idea that like children are like flower buds or they're like beautiful white snowflakes or things like that, where they're associated with images that kind of evoke like a very fragile sense, like a fragility. And the stories involving children often occurred like within nature, in which the children receive their lessons or their morals like within nature from birds or animals or something like that. So it just seemed to me that this idea of Tongshim, that Zer originally located within the earliest Korean children's literature from the colonial period, is still present in the literature to this day in North Korea. But again, I think it merits much more thorough and close reading of the contemporary children's literature. So definitely a future project there.
Yeah, I feel like no matter what culture, actually, a lot of societies do this where they associate children with nature. Maybe, like you said, it's to do with
Yeah.
fragility and purity,
Mm.
um, but do you think in any way that North Korea's conceptualization of childhood and its uh, socialization or the education of children differs from other authoritarian regimes? Do you find anything that's peculiar?
So I would say like North Korea, like any other socialist state, right, from the Cold War, it's like unique in its own way, but also very much steeped in this sort of idea of international socialism. So it's kind of both, right? So I would say like it's unique to North Korea, but it's also shaped by other socialist states' ideas. So in my research, right, I found that it's pretty clear from the sources, right, from the 1950s and 60s, that North Korea really emulated the Soviet Union, and it attempted, right, the North Korean state attempted to apply like Soviet ideas of socialism, Marxism to the North Korean situation at the time. But I think to say it's only like a copy of the Soviet Union or attempted copy is like inaccurate and doesn't really provide the whole picture, because there were plenty of ideas about families and children and, love and marriage and things like that from the Soviet Union that were not adopted by North Koreans. So it's not like they were just, like copying, pasting everything wholesale. They were trying to see what would work in the North Korean situation. And there's also like children's books that I found in my research from the 1950s that are translated directly from the Chinese. So they're just Chinese children's books. They're translated into Korean for North Korean children. So I thought that was interesting because that shows us that North Koreans found that this content in these Chinese books were very like appropriate for North Korean children as well. So I think that right, that's really interesting. And it's clear that these sort of Maoist ideas of like this kind of inclusiveness, right? Socialist inclusiveness, like mobilization are very present on top of what was already there, right? If we think of like how was childhood conceptualized in like Choson Korea and during the Japanese colonial period, like those thoughts, those ideas are obviously still there in the 1950s and 60s. So I plan to examine in my dissertation like how the North Korean state co-opted these pre-existing structures, right? Whether it was Choson Korean ideas or Japanese colonial ideas that were right kind of imposed upon Korea, how these ideas and structures, conceptions, how these were kind of molded by the North Korean state to fit this sort of new, quote unquote, new society, right, that the North Korean state was purporting to build, right? Because that was very big in North Korea that everything will be new now, but of course it's not really. It's a continuation of what was there, but sort of interpreted in a new way. And I think moreover, one more interesting thing is that North Korean government in the 50s and 60s, it worked really closely with other socialist states, right? It considered, especially in Eastern Europe, countries like Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria were considered like fraternal allies. And they were not only like crucial to the post-war recovery of North Korea, like physically and financially, but they were kind of important conceptually also, if that makes sense, right? The government North Korean government sent like war orphans, like right, North Korean children who were orphaned after the Korean War, right? North Korea didn't have enough infrastructure or personnel to like care for all these children, so they sent them abroad, especially to right, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, among other countries, and it sent those kids there to be fostered by these teachers there and then send them back to North Korea later. So I think, right, these interactions undoubtedly influenced how North Korean state and society's conception of children and childhood like would develop, right? And I found sources that kind of show the other side too in these Eastern European countries, right? Like how North Korea thought of its children and how these countries thought of North Korean children was actually important to these countries' own ideas of socialism. So that's something that I need to research more. But basically, there's a really tight connection between these countries that's like based on children, which I think is really cool. And right, the research potential there is really exciting.
Yeah, well, I think earlier on, like through the series, I think one of our first interviews, we were talking about well, migration in the border and displacement, and I asked her, so what do you think is unique about the migration patterns in North Korea? And she said, what I think is unique is that it's not unique. It's almost
Oh,
similar to
right.
every other state, and
Right.
so
That's
that's what
that's
I think is
exactly it.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we put North
Mm,
Korea as a sort of hermit state and it's just so different from
mm.
everyone else. But there's a lot of
Exceptional,
things
right.
exactly where they pick up from, other
Mm.
existing societies and ideologies and function
Right.
almost
No,
similar
yeah,
to ones.
that's
Yeah.
that's exactly what I always say I want to argue in my dissertation. Like I want to like de-exceptionalize North Korea and kind of show that the nation building processes that were occurring in North Korea are not not unique, right? They were kind of the same things that were occurring in especially socialist states, but also, decolonizing states that have this colonial legacy that are trying to like deal with how to move forward from that. So yeah, yeah, I love that it's like unique and that it's not unique.
Yeah, exactly. So those are all of my
Mhm.
questions for today. Thank you so
Mhm.
much for your time. Thank you for your
Yeah,
answers.
thank
It
you.
was lovely talking
Mhm.
to you. And thank you to our
Yeah,
viewers for watching. Goodbye.
thanks everyone. Bye.